The fire crackled low in the stone hearth of the Bennett ranch house, casting dancing shadows across the weathered walls that had sheltered 3 generations through Wyoming's harsh winters. Outside, snow fell in thick, lazy flakes, each one catching the amber light from the windows before disappearing into the December darkness of 1929. Jimmy Bennett sat slumped in the leather chair beside the fireplace, a telegram crumpled in his weathered hands. At 22, he carried himself like a much older man, his shoulders curved inward under the weight of disappointment. The Bank of Cheyenne had let him go that morning, another casualty of the economic collapse that had gripped the nation since Black Tuesday. Across from him, his grandfather Cole Bennett studied the young man's face with eyes that had seen 84 winters come and go. Cole's hands, gnarled by arthritis but still steady, rested on the arms of his rocking chair. His white hair caught the firelight, and when he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had weathered storms that would have broken lesser men. "You know, Jimmy," Cole began, his voice barely above a whisper, "there are winters that change everything. Winters that strip away everything you think you know about yourself and leave you standing naked in the cold, wondering if you'll see another sunrise." Jimmy looked up, his eyes hollow with defeat. "Grandpa, I don't know what I'm going to do. The bank, the crime, everything I thought was secure just disappeared overnight." Cole reached for his pipe, taking his time to pack it with tobacco. The ritual seemed to calm something restless in the old man's spirit. "Let me tell you about the winter of 1878. I was 33 years old then, just about a decade older than you are now. I thought I had everything figured out too." The old man struck a match, the flame illuminating the deep lines carved into his face by decades of sun, wind, and worry. "That was the winter I learned that sometimes you have to lose everything to find what really matters. Sometimes the worst blizzard of your life blows in something you never knew you needed." Jimmy shifted in his chair, drawn despite himself into the cadence of his grandfather's voice. Cole had a way of telling stories that made the past feel more real than the present, as if the ghosts of yesterday were sitting there with them by the fire. "It started with a broken wagon wheel," Cole continued, his eyes growing distant as the memories took hold. "But it ended with everything I am today. This ranch, this family, everything you see around you, it all began with that broken wheel on Christmas Eve, 1878. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows and sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Cole drew on his pipe, the sweet smoke curling around his silver hair like incense from an ancient altar. "You want to know how a man builds something that lasts, Jimmy? How he takes nothing and makes it into something his great-grandchildren will be proud of? Then settle back and listen, because this is a story about learning to trust when trust seems impossible, and finding grace when grace seems as distant as the stars." The Circle K Ranch sprawled across 50,000 acres of Wyoming territory, its boundaries marked more by the endurance of its cattle and the reach of its riders than by any surveyor's lines. In December of 1878, it was a kingdom built on grass and dreams, but those dreams were turning to dust under the weight of a collapsing cattle market. Cole Bennett stood in the doorway of the ranch's main house, his hat in his hands and his future hanging in the balance. Behind the massive oak desk, Marcus Hendricks, the ranch owner, shuffled through papers with the grim efficiency of a man preparing for his own funeral. "The market's gone to hell, Cole," Hendricks said without looking up. "Cattle that brought $15 a head last spring are selling for $8 now, if they're selling at all. The banks back east are calling in their loans, and I've got nowhere to turn." Cole's jaw tightened. He had seen the signs over the past months, the worried conversations between Hendricks and his foreman, the way expenses were being cut, the reduction in winter feed orders. But hearing it spoken aloud felt like watching a slow landslide finally pick up speed. "What does that mean for the men?" Cole asked, though he already knew the answer. Hendricks finally looked up, his face aged 10 years since summer. "Montgomery's made an offer. He'll take the ranch, the cattle, everything. But he's bringing his own crew. After the first of the year, there won't be work here for any of you." The words hit Cole like a physical blow. Jeremiah Montgomery was a cattle baron from Colorado, the kind of man who saw ranches like the Circle K as pieces on a chessboard. He would strip away everything that made this place special, turn it into just another corporate operation run by hired hands with no connection to the land. Cole had worked the Circle K for 8 years, ever since he had married Sarah, and needed steady work to support a family. The job paid $40 a month, enough to rent a small house in town and provide for his wife and children. But more than the money, the work had given him purpose. He was good at managing cattle, better at reading weather and grass conditions than men twice his age. The other cowboys looked to him for guidance, and Hendricks had promoted him to foreman when the position opened up 3 years ago. Now it was all ending, and Cole found himself facing the same uncertainty that had driven him to seek steady work in the first place. "I'm sorry, Cole," Hendricks continued. "If there was any other way, any chance at all of hanging on, you know I'd take it. But Sarah's medical bills nearly bankrupted me too. I know what it's like to watch your savings disappear while the doctors promise miracle cures that never come." Cole nodded, understanding the reference to his wife's long battle with tuberculosis. Sarah had died 2 years earlier, despite every treatment the doctors could offer and every dollar Cole could scrape together. The medical expenses had drained his savings and left him dependent on his ranch wages for survival. Walking back to the bunkhouse, Cole felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. Emma, Luke, and Rose were waiting for him back in their rented house in town, trusting him to provide for them the way he always had. Emma, at 9 years old, was old enough to understand when something was wrong. She had been asking questions about money lately, questions that Cole deflected with promises that everything would work out. But everything wasn't working out. With no job and less than $130 in savings, Cole faced the reality that he might not be able to keep his family together through the winter. The thought of asking for charity, of admitting that he couldn't provide for his children, burned in his throat like cheap whiskey. That evening, as snow began to fall in earnest, Cole gathered his children around the kitchen table in their small rented house. The lamplight flickered across their faces, and he saw Sarah in each of them. Emma's serious brown eyes, Luke's stubborn chin, Rose's delicate features and golden hair. "We're going to take a trip," he told them, keeping his voice steady and confident. "Pack your things, just what you really need. We're going to visit your Aunt Margaret in Cheyenne." It wasn't entirely a lie. Margaret, Sarah's sister, had written several times offering to help with the children. Cole had always declined, his pride keeping him from accepting charity. But pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. Emma studied his face with the unsettling perception that came from being forced to grow up too fast. "Are we coming back, Papa?" Cole met her gaze directly, the way he had always taught her to face difficult truths. "I don't know yet, sweetheart, but wherever we go together." The next morning dawned crystal clear and bitter cold, the kind of morning when the air felt sharp enough to cut glass. Cole loaded their wagon with everything they owned: clothes, bedding, Sarah's Bible, a few treasured possessions that connected them to happier times. The children sat bundled in the wagon bed, their breath forming clouds of vapor in the frozen air. As they pulled away from the house that had been their home for 3 years, Cole felt something fundamental shift inside him. He was no longer Cole Bennett, ranch foreman and respected member of the community. He was just another man with 3 children and an uncertain future, heading into winter with hope as his only compass. The road to Cheyenne stretched 60 miles across open prairie, normally a 2-day journey with overnight stops at way stations along the route. But as they traveled south through the morning, Cole noticed subtle changes in the weather that made his stomach tighten with unease. The wind shifted from its usual westerly direction to blow hard out of the north, carrying the bite of Arctic air and the promise of serious snow. The horses began to act nervous, their ears constantly moving as if listening for sounds beyond human hearing. Most ominous of all, the sky took on a peculiar quality that old-timers called snowlight, a pale, oppressive brightness that made the horizon seem to dissolve into nothing. By noon, the first flakes began to fall, small and hard as seed pearls. Within an hour, the snow was falling steadily, and the wind had picked up enough to drive it horizontal across the prairie. Cole urged the horses faster, hoping to reach the way station before the weather turned truly dangerous. But hope was not enough to overcome the forces gathering in the sky above them. By mid-afternoon, the wind was howling like a living thing, and the snow was falling so thick that Cole could barely see the horses in front of him. This wasn't just a winter storm. This was the kind of blizzard that old-timers talked about in hushed voices, the kind that could kill travelers who found themselves caught in the open. The temperature dropped with terrifying speed, falling what felt like degrees every few minutes. Cole's mustache began to accumulate ice from his frozen breath, and despite the heavy buffalo robe wrapped around them, the children began to shiver uncontrollably. "Papa, I can't feel my fingers," Rose whispered, her small voice nearly lost in the howling wind. Cole pulled the team to a halt, knowing they had to find shelter immediately. In the whiteout conditions, he could barely make out the ground 10 feet in front of the wagon. They were completely lost, somewhere on the vast Wyoming prairie, with no landmarks to guide them and no protection from the killing wind. It was then that disaster struck with the sudden violence that characterized life on the frontier. The wagon hit a hidden rut, a depression in the ground filled with drifted snow and disguised by the blizzard. The impact threw the wagon hard to one side, and Cole heard the sickening crack of wood giving way under stress. The right rear wheel collapsed inward, its wooden spokes splintering like kindling and its iron rim twisting into an impossible angle. The wagon lurched to a stop, tilted at a crazy angle that sent boxes and bundles sliding across the bed. Cole climbed down to assess the damage, his boots crunching through snow that was already knee-deep and getting deeper by the minute. What he saw made his blood turn to ice water. The wheel wasn't just broken, it was destroyed. The wooden hub had cracked clean through, and the axle housing was damaged beyond any hope of field repair. Even with proper tools and dry wood, this repair would take days. Cole had neither. They were stranded 15 miles from the nearest settlement in the worst blizzard he had ever seen, with 3 children and no shelter except the tilted wagon. Emma's voice cut through the wind, tight with the kind of fear that children feel when they sense that their parents are afraid. "Is it bad, Papa?" Cole looked up at his eldest daughter, at her serious face and eyes that trusted him to make everything right. He opened his mouth to reassure her, then closed it again. Emma was too smart for comfortable lies, and this situation was too serious for anything less than truth. Instead of answering, he began moving with the efficient urgency of a man who understood exactly how much danger they were in. He unhitched the horses and led them to the lee side of the wagon, where they could provide a windbreak. He gathered every blanket they owned and built a crude shelter against the wagon bed, using the tilted vehicle as a wall against the wind. "Thomas, Luke, help me gather anything that will burn," he called to his sons. "Rose, stay with Emma under the blankets." They worked together to build a fire, Cole's hands shaking not just from cold, but from the knowledge of what would happen if they couldn't get it started. The wind kept threatening to blow out their matches, and the snow was falling so hard that it hissed when it hit the small flames they managed to create. Finally, miraculously, the fire caught and held. Cole fed it carefully, nursing it from a tiny flicker to a real blaze that pushed back the darkness and provided a small circle of warmth against the infinite cold. But even as the fire burned, Cole knew it was only buying them time. They didn't have enough fuel to keep it going all night, and the cold was so intense that frostbite was a real danger even close to the flames. By morning, if they lived to see morning, they would be in no condition to travel even if he could somehow fix the wagon. The children huddled together under every blanket they owned, their faces pale and frightened in the firelight. Rose, the youngest, looked up at him with complete trust, as if she believed he could perform miracles through sheer force of will. "Will we be warm, Papa?" she asked in her small, clear voice. "Yes, darling," Cole heard himself say, the lie tasting bitter in his mouth. "We'll be warm." Night fell like a curtain dropping across the world, and the fire pushed back the darkness maybe 10 feet in every direction. Beyond that small circle of light, the world disappeared into howling wind and driving snow. Cole added more wood to the fire and watched the sparks spiral upward into the blackness, carrying with them his hopes and prayers for deliverance. He had been carrying this burden alone for 6 weeks now, ever since learning about the ranch sale. Every mile had been a battle, the weight of responsibility, the children's needs, the constant worry about money and the future. The pressure had built inside him like water behind a dam, and now the dam had finally burst. Sitting there in the snow with his broken wagon and terrified children, Cole admitted to himself what he had been trying to deny for months. He was failing. Despite his best efforts, despite his determination to be both father and mother to his children, he wasn't enough. Sarah had been the one with the gentle wisdom, the soft strength that could comfort a crying child or soothe a worried mind. He was just a man who was good with horses and cattle, trying to fill a role he was never meant to play. Luke huddled closer to his sisters, his young face drawn with worry. "Papa, are we going to freeze?" The question hung in the freezing air like an accusation. Cole looked at his son, at the trust and fear warring in the boy's eyes, and found he had no words. How do you tell a 7-year-old that you don't know if you'll see tomorrow? How do you admit that all your strength and experience might not be enough to save the people you love most? Instead of answering, Cole stared out past the firelight into the vast, indifferent darkness that surrounded them. The prairie stretched empty in every direction. No smoke from distant chimneys, no lights on any horizon, just endless grassland turning gray in the dying day. The wind answered his prayers with cold indifference, careless and cruel. But then, sometime near midnight, when hope had grown as thin as the flames of their dying fire, a miracle appeared in the form of lantern light. At first, Cole thought it was an illusion, a trick of exhausted eyes and desperate hope. But the light grew stronger, moving with purpose through the storm, and soon he could make out a figure on foot, leading something four-legged through the snow. Cole's hand moved instinctively toward his rifle, then stopped. The approaching figure was small, and the light was carried low and steady, the kind of cautious approach a prudent traveler would use when approaching strangers in the wilderness. But who would be traveling on foot in weather like this? Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere on Christmas Eve? The figure emerged slowly from the darkness into their firelight, resolving into a woman of perhaps 30 years, small-framed but moving with the efficient confidence of someone comfortable in harsh conditions. She wore a man's heavy coat over layers of wool, thick gloves, and a scarf wrapped high enough to cover most of her face. But her movements were unmistakably feminine. Behind her, she led a sturdy mule loaded with what appeared to be equipment and supplies. The animal was a Belgian draft, built for heavy work, and it followed her with the calm obedience of a well-trained partner. The woman stopped at the edge of their firelight, taking in the scene with quick, assessing eyes. The broken wagon, the sleeping children, the exhausted man. Her gaze settled on the damaged wheel, and Cole saw her expression change as she evaluated the extent of the problem. "That's a bad break," she said, her voice quiet and matter-of-fact, cutting through the wind with surprising clarity. Cole stood slowly, uncertain how to respond to this apparition that had materialized out of the storm like an answer to prayer. "We're managing," he said, the words automatic, his pride still functioning even in extremity. "You're not," the woman replied simply, moving closer to examine the wheel without asking permission. Her gloved hands traced the split in the wooden hub with professional expertise, testing the damage with the confidence of someone who understood exactly what she was looking at. "Hub's cracked clean through, axle housings compromised. You can't fix this without proper tools." "I'll figure something out," Cole said. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew how hollow they sounded. The woman glanced up at him in the firelight, and he could see her eyes clearly for the first time. Brown, calm, and utterly unimpressed by his bravado. There was something in those eyes that suggested she had seen through bigger lies than his, that she understood the difference between confidence and desperation. "My father was a blacksmith," she said, straightening up and pulling tools from her mule's pack. "I can fix this?" Cole's pride flared hot despite the cold, despite the impossible situation they were in. "Ma'am, I appreciate the offer, but—" His words were cut off by a small whimper from Rose, who was shivering despite the blankets wrapped around her. The sound cut through his pride like a knife, reminding him that this wasn't about his ego or his ability to handle problems alone. This was about 3 children who depended on him to make the right choice, even when that choice meant accepting help from a stranger. The woman was already unpacking her mule with practiced efficiency, producing a leather tool satchel, coils of rope, and several pieces of scrap metal. She moved with the purposeful confidence of someone who had done this kind of work before, and her lantern joined their fire, doubling the light and pushing back the darkness. "You got a name?" Cole asked finally, accepting the inevitable. "Grace," she replied, pulling a small metal file from her kit and testing the damaged wood. "Grace Mitchell. You?" "Cole Bennett. Those are my children. Emma, Luke, Rose." Grace nodded acknowledgement while continuing her examination of the wheel. Her movements were precise and economical, wasting no motion in the bitter cold. "How far to wherever you're headed?" "Cheyenne. My sister-in-law has a place there." It wasn't quite a lie, though Margaret's place was just a small apartment above a dry goods store. Long way yet, Grace observed, pulling more tools from her pack. You got coffee? Might want to make some. This'll take hours. Cole built up the fire and set water to boil, grateful for something useful to do. As he worked, he watched Grace Mitchell begin the seemingly impossible task of repairing their wagon in the middle of a blizzard. She had a portable forge, a clever design that folded into a compact package but opened into a functional workspace. Within minutes, she had hot coals glowing despite the wind and snow. You heat the metal first, she explained to Emma, who had crept closer to watch the proceedings with fascination. Heat makes it bend easier, makes it remember that it can change. Then you shape it while it's soft, let it cool hard where you want it to stay. Emma nodded, mesmerized by the sight of Grace working metal with hammer and tongs, shaping pieces of iron into precisely what was needed to reinforce the broken wheel. There was something almost magical about watching the transformation, seeing Grace take scattered pieces of scrap and turn them into exactly the solution their desperate situation required. By 2 in the morning, the wheel held. Grace tested her work thoroughly, putting weight on it and rocking the wagon gently to ensure the repair would hold under stress. The result looked rough and improvised, but it was solid, metal strapping reinforcing the cracked hub like a splint on a broken limb. That'll get you to the next settlement, Grace said, accepting the cup of coffee Cole offered her. Maybe farther if you're careful with it. Their fingers brushed as he handed her the tin cup, and Cole felt a shock that had nothing to do with the cold. Her hands, despite the gloves and the harsh work, had a feminine grace that contrasted sharply with their obvious strength and capability. I don't know how to thank you, he said, meaning it completely. Grace sipped the coffee carefully, studying him over the rim of the cup. Don't need thanks, just doing what needs doing. The fire burned lower, coals glowing orange in the deep night, and Cole's children slept peacefully now that the crisis had passed. For the first time in hours, he allowed himself to believe they might actually survive this night. Grace sat across from him, her coat pulled tight against the cold, her mule dozing nearby with the patience of an animal accustomed to strange schedules and difficult conditions. You traveling alone? Cole asked, curiosity getting the better of his exhaustion. For now. That's dangerous. Grace raised an eyebrow, the ghost of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. So is hauling 3 children across the frontier alone. Cole conceded the point with a nod. Around them, the prairie stretched vast and indifferent, but here in this small circle of firelight, something like understanding existed between 2 people who had been carved hollow by loss and were making their way as best they could. My wife died 2 years back, Cole found himself saying, the words emerging without conscious decision. Tuberculosis. I've been making my way since then, but it's been, yeah. He gestured at the broken wagon, at the impossible situation they had been in just hours before. Hard. Grace was quiet for a long moment, then spoke with the same matter-of-fact tone she had used to assess the wagon wheel. I lost my husband last spring. Farm was mortgaged heavy, bank took it for debts. I sold what was left, bought this mule and my daddy's tools. Been heading west ever since, no particular destination. Just seemed like all that was left to do. They sat in comfortable silence, 2 people temporarily sharing warmth and firelight, while the vast wilderness pressed in around them. Cole studied Grace across the flames, taking in details he had missed during the crisis of the repair. The competent way she handled her tools, the steady nerves that allowed her to work in impossible conditions, the practical mind that had solved in hours a problem that might have killed them all. His children needed that kind of competence in their lives. He needed it too, though admitting that chafed against every notion of masculine self-reliance he had been raised to believe. But Sarah had been the one with the practical wisdom, the one who could look at a problem and see solutions that escaped him entirely. Without her, he felt like he was trying to navigate by stars he couldn't quite see. Come with us, he said suddenly, the words tumbling out before his rational mind could stop them. Grace looked up, surprised by the abruptness of the invitation. To Cheyenne, Cole continued, trying to organize his thoughts into something approaching reason. I mean, we could use your skills, would be a fair trade, your tools and knowledge for company and shared supplies. Grace set down her coffee cup and studied him with those calm brown eyes. That's a long journey for temporary companions. Maybe it doesn't have to be temporary, Cole said, then caught himself. I mean, you said you were heading west anyway. Might as well have company for part of the trip. He gestured at his sleeping children. They could use someone who knows which end of a hammer to hold. And I could use a partner who understands that sometimes the best way to fix something is to change how it works entirely. Grace was quiet for a long moment, considering the proposal from angles Cole couldn't guess. Finally, she spoke. Until Cheyenne, then. After that, we'll see where things stand. That's fair enough, Cole said, extending his hand across the dying fire. Partners? Grace shook his hand with a grip that was calloused and strong but undeniably feminine. Partners. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, Christmas morning creeping toward them with the promise of a new day and new possibilities. Cole felt something ease in his chest. Not quite hope yet, but maybe hope's distant cousin. The possibility that he wasn't as alone as he had thought. Get some sleep, Grace said, settling against her mule's warm flank and pulling her blanket around her. We'll want to start early. Test that wheel while the ground's still frozen solid. Within minutes, her breathing had evened into sleep, leaving Cole alone with his thoughts and the dying embers of their fire. He looked at the repaired wagon, at the sleeping woman who had appeared like a guardian angel in their darkest hour, at his children resting peacefully for the first time in days. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new uncertainties, and the continuing struggle to build something lasting from the fragments of their broken lives. But tonight, for the first time since Sarah's death, Cole Bennett wasn't facing those challenges entirely alone. The wheel was repaired. Help had arrived when hope seemed impossible, and the road ahead, while still uncertain, no longer looked quite so dark or quite so lonely. In the distance, the wind continued to howl across the Wyoming prairie, but its voice no longer sounded like a threat. Instead, it carried the promise of change, of new beginnings born from the marriage of necessity and grace, of partnerships forged in the crucible of survival and tempered by the recognition that sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is admit they need help. The winter of 1878 was just beginning, but Cole Bennett had already learned its first and most important lesson, that miracles sometimes come disguised as strangers with practical skills and generous hearts, arriving exactly when hope seems lost and salvation impossible. As he finally allowed himself to sleep, Cole's last conscious thought was a prayer of gratitude for broken wheels and blizzards, for the strange mercy of disasters that force us to accept the help we never knew we needed, and for the possibility that tomorrow might hold promises he couldn't yet imagine. The fire burned down to embers, but the warmth it had created lingered, a small victory against the infinite cold of the Wyoming winter night. The old grandfather clock in the corner of the ranch house chimed midnight, its bronze voice cutting through the whisper of falling snow outside. Jimmy shifted in his chair, drawn deeper into the story despite himself. The firelight played across his face, and for a moment, Cole could see the boy Jimmy had been, the one who used to sit in the same spot listening to tales of cowboys and cattle drives. You took help from a stranger, Jimmy said, his voice carrying a note of surprise. You who never asked anyone for anything. Cole smiled, understanding the question beneath his grandson's words. Pride's a luxury you can't afford when your family's at stake, Jimmy. Took me 33 years to learn that lesson. But once I did, it changed everything. He drew on his pipe, the sweet smoke curling upward in the lamplight. That first morning with Grace, I thought she was temporary help. Someone passing through who'd done a kindness and would move on. I had no idea she was about to save more than just a wagon wheel. Christmas morning of 1878 dawned crystal clear and bitter cold, the kind of day when the air itself seemed to ring like a struck bell. The blizzard had passed during the night, leaving behind a world transformed. Snow drifted in sculptured waves across the prairie, and every blade of grass wore a coating of ice that caught the early sunlight like scattered diamonds. Cole woke to the sound of Grace already moving around their camp, efficiently packing her tools and checking the harness on her mule. She moved with the purposeful quiet of someone accustomed to early mornings and hard travel, and when she saw him stirring, she nodded toward the coffee pot sitting beside the rebuilt fire. Ground's frozen solid, she said by way of greeting. Good time to test that repair. The children woke slowly, blinking in the bright morning light that reflected off the snow with painful intensity. Rose immediately gravitated toward Grace, drawn by some instinct children have for recognizing safety and competence. Emma studied their new companion with the careful assessment of a girl forced to grow up too quickly, while Luke maintained the cautious distance of a boy who had learned not to trust too easily. As they broke camp and prepared to travel, Cole watched Grace work with growing admiration. She understood horses and mules the way some people understood books, reading their moods and needs with uncanny accuracy. When his mare favored her left front hoof, Grace noticed immediately and found the small stone lodged between the shoe and frog that Cole had missed entirely. "She'll go lame if that's not tended," Grace said, using a hoof pick from her extensive tool collection. "Probably picked it up yesterday in all that rough going." Her hands were gentle but firm as she worked, and the mare stood quietly despite being handled by a stranger. There was something in Grace's touch that communicated safety and competence, a quality that animals recognized instinctively. They followed the Powder River south toward Casper, the frozen waterway serving as their guide through country that looked entirely different under its blanket of snow. The pace was necessarily slow. The makeshift repair on their wagon wheel required careful attention to road conditions, and the snow made footing treacherous for the horses. But the slow pace gave Cole time to observe his traveling companion more carefully. Grace rode with the easy confidence of someone who had spent years in the saddle, and she knew the country they were crossing with the familiarity of long experience. When they needed to find the best ford across a tributary creek, she led them to it without hesitation. When the wind picked up and threatened another storm, she pointed out a grove of cottonwoods that provided perfect shelter. More importantly, she began to integrate naturally into the rhythm of their small family. When they stopped to rest the horses, she helped Emma practice reading from Sarah's Bible, her patient instruction revealing an education that seemed unusual for a frontier blacksmith. When Luke shyly showed her an interesting rock he had found, she examined it with serious attention and identified it as a piece of petrified wood, older than anyone could imagine. "See these rings?" she asked, tracing the patterns in the stone with her finger. "Each one represents a year in that tree's life. This piece of wood is so old, it turned to stone, but we can still see the story of how it grew." Luke's eyes widened with wonder, and Cole felt a pang of recognition. Sarah had possessed that same ability to turn everyday discoveries into moments of magic and learning. By the third day of travel, they had fallen into a routine that felt surprisingly natural. Grace rose before dawn to start the fire and set coffee brewing. Cole tended to the animals and loaded the wagon. Emma helped with breakfast, while Luke and Rose played in the snow, their laughter a bright counterpoint to the serious business of survival. It was on that third morning that their peaceful routine was shattered by the appearance of 5 riders on the horizon. Cole spotted them first, dark figures moving against the white landscape with the purposeful approach of men who knew exactly what they wanted. Something in their posture, the way they spread out as they approached, set off alarm bells in his mind. "Grace," he called quietly, not wanting to frighten the children. "We've got company." She looked up from packing her tools, following his gaze to the approaching riders. Her expression didn't change, but Cole noticed that her hand moved casually to rest on the butt of the pistol holstered at her hip. "Could be travelers," she said mildly, but her tone suggested she didn't believe it any more than he did. The riders drew closer, resolving into rough-looking men mounted on horses that showed hard use and poor care. Their leader, a massive man with black hair and a beard that hadn't seen a razor in months, wore a buffalo coat that had seen better decades. The others were cut from similar cloth, hard-faced, armed, and carrying themselves with the casual arrogance of men accustomed to taking what they wanted. "Morning, folks," the big man called out as they surrounded the wagon. His voice was jovial enough, but his eyes moved constantly, cataloging their possessions and assessing their ability to resist. "Name's Mike Garrett. These are my boys. Couldn't help noticing you folks are traveling light for this kind of country." Cole kept his hands visible and his voice steady. "We're managing well enough." Garrett's laugh was like the bark of a dog. "Oh, I'm sure you are. Fine-looking woman you got there, and healthy children. But winter's got a long way to go yet, and there's all kinds of dangers out here for folks traveling alone." One of the other riders, a thin man with nervous eyes, spoke up. "Mike, there's quality horse flesh, and look at them tools the lady's got packed. Worth some money, I'd say." Cole felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came before violence, the hyper-awareness of potential threats and available weapons. But before he could respond, Grace spoke up from beside the wagon. "You gentlemen looking for work?" she asked conversationally. "I'm always willing to hire good men for honest wages." Garrett's grin widened, showing teeth stained brown with tobacco. "Oh, ma'am, we're not looking for work. We're more in the business of redistribution, you might say. Helping folks who have too much share with folks who don't have enough." "Redistribution," Grace repeated thoughtfully. "That's a fancy word for stealing." The temperature seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Garrett's smile disappeared and his hand moved to rest on his gun butt. "Now that's not a very friendly way to talk to visitors, ma'am, especially when those visitors are offering their protection for a reasonable fee." Cole stepped forward slightly, putting himself between the riders and his children. "We're not interested in protection. We'll be moving on now." "See, that's where you're wrong," Garrett said, his voice hardening. "You're not going anywhere until we've had a chance to inspect your cargo. Make sure you're not carrying anything that belongs to other people." Emma made a small sound of fear from the wagon, and Cole felt something cold and deadly settle in his chest. These men weren't ordinary thieves looking for easy money. They were predators who enjoyed the hunt as much as the kill, and they had identified his family as prey. "Papa," Rose whispered from the wagon bed, her small voice cutting through the tension like a blade. The sound of his daughter's fear seemed to flip a switch in Cole's mind. His hand moved toward his rifle with calculated deliberation, but before he could clear leather, Grace spoke again. "Mr. Garrett," she said pleasantly, "I think you should know that my husband was Robert Mitchell of the 4th Cavalry, and he taught me everything he knew about dealing with men like you." Garrett laughed. "Lady, your husband ain't here, and there's 5 of us to 2 of you. Even if you know which end of that gun to point, those aren't good odds." Grace smiled, and something in that smile made Cole's blood run cold. Who said anything about odds? What happened next took less than 3 seconds, but felt like an eternity. Grace's hand moved to her gun with fluid precision, drawing and firing in one smooth motion. Her first shot took the nervous man clean out of his saddle before he knew what was happening. Her second shot, fired while the echo of the first was still ringing across the prairie, caught another rider in the shoulder and spun him around like a top. Cole's own rifle was up and firing by the time Grace's third shot rang out, and between them they turned the morning air into a symphony of gunpowder and fury. The outlaws' horses reared and plunged, throwing off their riders' aim, and within moments 3 of the 5 men were down or wounded. Garrett himself had managed to clear his pistol, but as he swung it toward Grace, Emma Bennett did something that would become family legend. The 9-year-old girl picked up a chunk of ice from the wagon bed and hurled it with all her might, striking Garrett in the face just as he pulled the trigger. The shot went wild, and before he could recover, Cole's rifle spoke with final authority. The silence that followed was deafening. 5 men lay in the snow. Their threat ended as quickly as it had begun. The horses stood blowing clouds of vapor in the cold air, and somewhere in the distance, a crow called with harsh indifference to human violence. Grace methodically reloaded her pistol, her hand steady as stone. "Emma, that was excellent thinking." "Luke, Rose, stay in the wagon while your papa and I clean this up." Cole stared at her, seeing her clearly for the first time. This wasn't just a competent blacksmith who happened to know one end of a gun from the other. This was a woman who had been trained by a cavalry soldier, someone who understood violence and wasn't intimidated by it. "Your husband really was 4th Cavalry," he said, and it wasn't a question. "Among other things," Grace replied, checking the fallen men to make sure they posed no further threat. "Robert was what they called a special scout, the kind they sent after particularly difficult problems." She moved among the bodies with professional efficiency, gathering weapons and ammunition. "These men have been wanted for robbery and murder from here to Colorado. There's probably bounty money if we can prove who they are." Cole watched her work, understanding dawning slowly. You weren't just heading west with no destination. You were hunting them. Grace paused in her search of Garrett's saddlebags. "Not specifically, but men like this leave tracks if you know how to read them. Robert taught me that too." From Garrett's coat, she pulled a leather pouch that clinked with the weight of coin. $63 in gold and silver, probably stolen from their last victims. She handed the pouch to Cole. Your children shouldn't have to see this kind of thing. But in this country, sometimes violence finds you whether you're looking for it or not. The important thing is being ready when it does. Emma climbed down from the wagon, moving with careful dignity. Miss Grace, are you a lady outlaw? Grace smiled, the expression transforming her face completely. No, sweetheart, but I learned from someone who hunted outlaws, and that's almost the same thing. They spent the next hour dragging the bodies into a ravine and scattering the outlaws' horses. It was grim work, but necessary. In this country, dead men told no tales, and 5 fewer predators meant safer travel for other families. As they prepared to move on, Luke approached Grace with shy curiosity. Did it hurt them when you shot them? Grace knelt to meet the boy's eyes. Yes, Luke, it probably did. Taking a life is never easy, even when it's necessary. But sometimes good people have to do hard things to protect the people they love. She gestured toward the wagon where his sisters waited. If I hadn't stopped those men, they would have hurt your papa and taken you children to sell to people who would have treated you very badly. Sometimes the only way to prevent greater evil is to do something that seems wrong, but isn't. Luke nodded solemnly, processing this wisdom with the seriousness of a child trying to understand the adult world. I'm glad you were here to protect us. Me too, Grace said softly. But remember, Luke, the best protection is avoiding trouble in the first place. Your papa is teaching you that by being careful about where we travel and how we behave around strangers. As they resumed their journey, Cole found himself studying Grace with new understanding. She wasn't just competent, she was formidable. Trained by a cavalry scout in skills that most frontier women never learned, she represented a type of female self-reliance that challenged everything he thought he knew about proper roles and relationships. But rather than feeling threatened by her capabilities, Cole found himself grateful. His children were safer with Grace Mitchell as their traveling companion than they would be with most men. She had proven herself in combat and shown wisdom in its aftermath, explaining violence to children in terms they could understand without glorifying it. That evening, as they made camp beside a frozen creek, Grace took Emma aside for a private conversation. Cole pretended to tend the fire while listening to their quiet voices. You did well today, Grace was saying. Quick thinking and good aim with that ice chunk. But I want you to understand something important. Yes, ma'am. What happened today was not normal. Most people go their whole lives without seeing violence like that. I don't want you to think that shooting people is something women do regularly, or that it's something to be proud of. Emma's voice was small but serious. But you saved us. Yes, I did. But I would much rather have talked those men into leaving us alone, or avoided them entirely. Violence is always the last choice, Emma, never the first. Do you understand? I think so. Like when Luke hits me, Papa makes him apologize and do extra chores instead of hitting him back. Grace laughed quietly. Exactly like that. We try to solve problems with words first, then with the other consequences, and only use force when everything else has failed and people we love are in danger. The conversation continued, Grace carefully explaining concepts of justified force and moral responsibility in terms a 9-year-old could grasp. Cole found himself impressed not just with her wisdom, but with her instinct for teaching. She understood that children needed to process violence when they witnessed it, that leaving them confused and frightened would do more harm than honest explanation. Later, when the children were asleep and they sat by the dying fire, Cole finally asked the question that had been burning in his mind all day. Your husband, what really happened to him? Grace stared into the flames for a long moment before answering. Mine cave-in near Deadwood. Robert was working as a guard for a mining operation that had been having trouble with claim jumpers. When the shaft collapsed, he went back in 3 times to pull out trapped miners. The 4th time, he didn't come back out. Her voice remained steady, but Cole could hear the pain beneath the control. 7 men owed their lives to Robert Mitchell. I got condolence letters from all of them, telling me what a hero my husband was. But heroes don't keep you warm at night or help you figure out how to pay the mortgage. Cole understood that particular form of loss, the way grief mixed with anger at being left behind to handle impossible situations alone. Sarah was sick for almost a year before she died. Toward the end, she kept apologizing for leaving me with the children, as if dying was something she was choosing to do to hurt us. The worst part, Grace continued, is how everyone expects you to be grateful for the time you had, as if losing someone you love is somehow made better by the fact that you love them in the first place. They sat in comfortable silence, two people who understood the particular loneliness of surviving the person who had been the other half of their world. Around them, the Wyoming night pressed close, but here beside their fire, they had created a small space where shared grief became more bearable through acknowledgement. Grace, Cole said finally, I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. She nodded, waiting. Are you running from something? Those skills you showed today, that equipment you carry, it's not what most women have. If there's trouble following you, I need to know about it. Grace was quiet for so long that Cole began to think she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Robert left me more than just his memory. He left me his contacts, his knowledge, and his enemies. There are men who didn't appreciate his effectiveness as a scout, men who might come looking for the woman who inherited his information. She met Cole's eyes directly. I'm not actively being hunted, as far as I know, but I'm not exactly safe either. That's part of why I've been moving constantly, never staying in one place long enough to establish patterns. Cole considered this information, weighing the additional danger against the protection Grace's skills provided. Is that why you agreed to travel with us? Because we provide cover? Partly, Grace admitted. A woman traveling alone attracts attention. A woman traveling with a family looks normal, unremarkable. What's the other part? Grace smiled, and in the firelight she looked younger, more vulnerable. The other part is that I was getting tired of being alone, tired of having no one to talk to except my mule, tired of making decisions with no one to discuss them with. When I saw you with your children, saw how much you loved them, despite how hard everything has become, I remembered what it felt like to be part of something larger than just survival. Cole felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of tensions he hadn't even realized he was carrying. Grace, I want you to know something. Those men today, they would have killed us all if you hadn't been here. My children are alive because of your skills and your quick thinking. Your children are alive because their father is brave enough to accept help when it's offered, Grace corrected. Not every man would have let me fight beside him instead of ordering me to hide with the children. Maybe not every man has children worth protecting. Grace's smile widened. Maybe not every man is smart enough to recognize good help when it appears. The next morning brought the kind of bitter cold that makes the air itself seem solid, each breath forming clouds of vapor that froze before they could dissipate. But despite the harsh conditions, their small group moved with increased confidence. The violence of the previous day had tested them and proven their ability to work together under pressure. More importantly, it had established trust. Cole now knew that Grace Mitchell was exactly what she claimed to be, a competent, dangerous woman who could be counted on in a crisis. And Grace knew that Cole Bennett was the kind of man who would fight beside a partner rather than trying to protect her like a helpless ornament. It was shortly after noon when they came upon the river. The Powder River at this point was usually an easy crossing, shallow and wide, with a sandy bottom that provided good footing for horses and wheels. But the winter of 1878 had changed everything. The river was frozen, but not solidly. Ice formed and broke and reformed in irregular patterns, creating a treacherous surface that might hold a man's weight in one spot and plunge him into freezing water 2 steps later. Cole studied the crossing with growing unease. The alternative route would add 3 days to their journey, 3 days they couldn't afford with winter deepening and their supplies running low. But the ice looked unstable, dangerous, the kind of gamble that could kill them all if they guessed wrong. What do you think? He asked Grace, trusting her judgment. She walked to the edge of the ice, testing it with a long stick she had cut from a willow tree. The ice held her weight, but Cole could see dark water moving underneath, hear the occasional crack and groan of stressed frozen surface. It's risky, she said finally, but I think we can make it if we're careful. We'll need to redistribute the weight in the wagon, spread the load out as much as possible. They spent the next hour rearranging their cargo, moving the heaviest items to the front of the wagon and securing everything with extra rope. Grace tied her mule to the back of the wagon, creating additional weight distribution and a backup plan if the horses broke through. When we start across, Grace told the children, Don't panic if the ice cracks or the wagon tilts. Ice makes noise when it's working, but that doesn't always mean it's going to break. Your papa and I know what we're doing. Rose looked up at her with absolute trust. Promise? Grace knelt to meet the little girl's eyes. I promise we'll do everything we can to keep you safe. They entered the river at its narrowest point, the horses picking their way carefully across ice that groaned and shifted under their weight. For the first 50 feet, everything went well. The ice held, the wagon rolled smoothly, and Cole began to think they might make it across without incident. Then Luke decided to get a better look at the ice beneath them. The boy leaned over the side of the wagon, fascinated by the patterns of frozen water and curious about the dark shapes moving underneath. His weight shift was slight, but it was enough to change the wagon's balance at exactly the wrong moment. The ice gave way with a crack like thunder. Luke fell through the surface into water so cold it stopped his heart for a moment, the shock driving all air from his lungs in a soundless scream. The current, stronger than it appeared from above, immediately began to drag him downstream. Grace didn't hesitate. She threw herself from the wagon seat into the black water without a moment's consideration for her own safety. The cold hit her like a physical blow, but she fought through it, swimming hard against the current toward the boy who was thrashing in panic. Cole hauled on the reins, fighting to keep the horses calm, while his son and their partner disappeared beneath the broken ice. Emma screamed and Rose began to cry, but he couldn't spare attention for their fear. If he lost control of the team, they would all go into the water. Grace reached Luke just as the boy's strength was giving out. She grabbed him with one arm and fought toward shore, but the current was stronger than expected, and the cold was sapping her strength with terrifying speed. Her heavy clothes, soaked through, dragged at her like anchors. Cole made a decision that went against every instinct of self-preservation. He grabbed his lasso and dove into the water after them, the rope tied around his waist and secured to the wagon. The cold was indescribable. It drove into his bones like knives and made his muscles seize with shock. But he fought through it, swimming hard toward Grace and Luke, the rope playing out behind him like a lifeline. He reached them just as Grace's strength was failing. Luke was unconscious, his lips blue with cold, and Grace was barely keeping his head above water. Cole grabbed them both and signaled to Emma, who had taken control of the horses with remarkable composure. "Pull!" he shouted, and his daughter did exactly that, urging the team forward until the rope began to drag on all three of them toward shore. They dragged themselves onto solid ground in a tangle of limbs and rope, coughing up river water and shivering so violently they could barely stand. Luke was unconscious, his breathing shallow and his skin dangerously pale. Grace, despite her own condition, immediately began working on the boy, using techniques Robert had taught her for treating shock and hypothermia. She stripped off his wet clothes and wrapped him in every dry blanket they had, then began the slow process of warming him back to consciousness. "Fire," she managed through chattering teeth. "Need fire now." Cole and Emma worked together to gather dry wood and build the largest fire they had ever attempted, feeding it until the flames roared high enough to push back the deadly cold. Gradually, slowly, Luke's color began to return. When the boy finally opened his eyes and spoke his first word, it was Grace's name. "Miss Grace, are you hurt?" Grace looked down at him with tears freezing on her cheeks. "No, sweetheart, I'm fine, but you scared us all pretty badly." Luke struggled to sit up, his young mind already processing what had happened. "You saved me. You jumped in the water to save me." "Well, that's what partners do," Grace said simply. "We take care of each other." Cole watched this exchange with something approaching awe. Grace had risked her life without hesitation to save his son, had put Luke's safety ahead of her own survival without even thinking about it. That kind of instant, selfless courage couldn't be taught or learned. It was character revealed under pressure, the kind of character that defined a person's true worth. As they huddled around the fire, warming themselves and drying their clothes, Cole felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of their relationship. Grace Mitchell wasn't just a traveling companion or even a useful partner. She was family now, chosen family created by shared danger and proven loyalty. "Grace," he said when they had all warmed enough to speak normally, "I need to tell you something." She looked up from checking Luke's breathing, her eyes still bright with concern for the boy. What happened here today? What you did? I'll never forget it. Luke is alive because you were willing to die for him. That's not something you do for strangers or temporary partners. Grace was quiet for a moment, then spoke with the same matter-of-fact tone she used for everything else. I didn't think about it, Cole. I just saw him in the water and went after him. It's what any mother would do. The word hung in the air between them, unexpected and loaded with meaning. Grace seemed surprised that she had used it, but she didn't take it back. Is that what you are to us? Cole asked quietly. A mother? Grace looked at each of his children in turn. Emma, who had shown such courage and competence during the crisis. Luke, who was alive because of her quick action. Rose, who had attached herself to Grace with the complete trust of the very young. I don't know, she said honestly. I know I love them like they were my own. I know I'd die for any of them without thinking twice. I know that when I look at your family, I see something I want to be part of more than anything I've ever wanted. Cole felt his heart hammer against his ribs. Grace, what are you saying? I'm saying that somewhere between Christmas Eve and today, I stopped thinking about this as a temporary arrangement. I stopped planning for the day I'd move on and started hoping for reasons to stay. She met his eyes directly, her own shining with unshed tears. I'm saying I think I'm falling in love with all of you, and I don't know what to do about it. Cole moved closer to her, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her body. What you do about it is stay. What you do about it is let us love you back. It's not that simple, Cole. I'm not Sarah. I never could be. I'm not asking you to be Sarah, Cole said firmly. I'm asking you to be Grace. The woman who saves broken wagon wheels and fights off outlaws and jumps into frozen rivers to save children who aren't even hers. The woman who's brave enough to build something new instead of trying to recreate something that's gone. Grace was crying now, tears streaming down her face as years of loneliness and fear finally found their release. I'm scared, Cole. I'm scared of caring this much and then losing it all again. So am I, Cole admitted. But I'm more scared of living the rest of my life wondering what might have been if I'd been brave enough to try. He took her hands in his, feeling the calluses from her work, the strength that had saved his son's life. Grace Mitchell, I don't know what tomorrow's going to bring. I don't know if we'll make it through this winter or if we'll find work in Cheyenne, or if any of this will work out the way we hope it will. He paused, gathering his courage for words that would change everything. But I know that I love you. I love your strength and your skills and the way you make my children feel safe. I love the way you see solutions where I see problems and the way you make me want to be a better man than I thought I could be. Grace's smile was brilliant despite her tears. Cole Bennett, are you asking me to marry you? I'm asking you to be my partner in more than just travel. I'm asking you to help me raise these children and build something lasting together. I'm asking you to take a chance on a broken-down cowboy with more problems than prospects and see if we can fix each other the way you fixed that wagon wheel. Grace laughed, the sound bright and joyful in the cold air. Yes, she said simply. Yes to all of it. They kissed then, gently and carefully, like people handling something precious and fragile. Around them, their children watched with the solemn attention of witnesses to something momentous. Does this mean Miss Grace is going to be our mama? Rose asked with the directness of the very young. Cole and Grace looked at each other, then back at the little girl. If she wants to be, Cole said. If you want me to be, Grace corrected. Emma spoke up with 9-year-old seriousness. We want you to stay forever, Miss Grace. We want you to be part of our family for real. Luke, still wrapped in blankets but recovering his color, added his own voice. You saved my life. That makes you family no matter what. Grace gathered all 3 children into her arms, holding them close as if she could protect them from everything the world might throw at them. Then it's settled, she said. We're family now, all of us together. As the sun set over the frozen river, casting long shadows across the snow, they began to plan their future. But unknown to them, that future was about to face its greatest test yet. In 2 days, they would receive news that would change everything they thought they knew about their destination and their prospects. For now, though, they were simply a family warming themselves by a fire, bound together by love, freely given, and courage proven in crisis. The worst of winter was still ahead of them, but they would face it together, and that made all the difference in the world. The ice continued to crack and shift in the river behind them, but his voice no longer sounded like a threat. Instead, it sang of obstacles overcome and partnerships strengthened, of love that could survive the coldest winter and emerge stronger for the testing. Grace Mitchell had jumped into freezing water to save a child who wasn't hers. Cole Bennett had followed without hesitation. And in that moment of shared courage, they had become something neither had been alone. Complete. The clock struck 2 in the morning, but neither Cole nor Jimmy showed any sign of fatigue. The story had taken on a life of its own, drawing them both deeper into memories that felt more real than the present moment. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, and the world lay silent under its white blanket. Jimmy leaned forward in his chair, his earlier despair forgotten in the magic of his grandfather's tale. So you were engaged to marry Grace, but you still had no idea where you were going or how you'd survive. Cole smiled, remembering the mixture of joy and terror that had filled those days. That's right, son. Love doesn't solve practical problems. It just makes you willing to face them together. And we were about to face the biggest test of all. He knocked the ashes from his pipe and began to refill it, his movements deliberate and thoughtful. You see, Jimmy, sometimes when you think you've lost everything, the universe has a way of showing you that you never really knew what everything meant in the first place. The morning after their river crossing brought news that would change the course of their lives forever. They had made camp in a grove of cottonwoods, taking time to dry their clothes and recover from the near disaster on the ice. Grace was teaching Emma the basics of metalworking, using her portable forge to demonstrate how heat could transform iron into exactly what was needed. The secret, Grace explained, as she shaped a piece of metal with practiced strokes of her hammer, is understanding that everything has the potential to become something else. This piece of iron could become a nail, a horseshoe, a hinge for a door, or part of a wheel rim. The metal doesn't care what it becomes, as long as you apply the right amount of heat and pressure at the right time. Emma watched with fascination as the red-hot metal bent to Grace's will. Could you teach me to do that? If you want to learn, and if your papa agrees, I'll teach you everything I know. Grace paused in her work to smile at the girl. But remember, Emma, being a blacksmith isn't just about making things. It's about understanding what people need and finding ways to provide it. The best smiths are the ones who can look at a problem and see the solution hidden inside it. It was then that they heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats, a single rider moving fast across the frozen ground. Cole reached for his rifle out of habit, but relaxed when he recognized Tommy Peterson, one of the younger hands from the Circle K ranch. Tommy's horse was lathered with sweat despite the cold, evidence of hard riding. The young cowboy's face was grim as he pulled up beside their camp. Cole, thank God I found you. Tommy swung down from his saddle, his words coming in rapid bursts. I got news from the ranch, and it ain't good. Cole felt his stomach drop. What kind of news? Mr. Hendricks is dead. Heart attack, 3 days ago. And Mrs. Hendricks, she ain't waiting for spring to sell. Montgomery's already been out to the ranch with his crew, and they're taking possession immediately. The words hit Cole like physical blows. Marcus Hendricks had been a good man, one of the few ranch owners who treated his hands with genuine respect. But more importantly, his death meant the end of any hope that the sale might be delayed or reconsidered. There's more, Tommy continued, his young face pale with exhaustion and worry. Montgomery's not just buying the cattle operation. He's planning to clear out every building, every fence, everything that shows the land's been worked. Says he wants a clean slate for his own operations. Grace looked up from her forge, understanding immediately. What about the men, the other hands? Gone. All of us, as of yesterday. Montgomery brought his own crew from Colorado, and he made it clear that none of the old hands were welcome to stay. He even had his foreman tell us that anyone caught on the property after sunset would be considered a trespasser. Cole felt the last of his old life crumble away like sand. The Circle K Ranch had been more than just a youth. It had been a community, a place where he belonged and where his skills were valued. Now it was gone, erased as if it had never existed. What are you going to do? He asked Tommy. The young man shrugged, trying to maintain bravado despite his obvious fear. Head south, I guess. Maybe find work on one of the ranches in Colorado. Winter's a bad time to be looking for work. But what choice do I have? After Tommy rode away, Cole and Grace sat by their fire in heavy silence. The children sensed the gravity of the adults' mood and played quietly, giving their parents space to process the devastating news. Well, Grace said finally, I guess that settles our destination question. Cole looked at her, confused. How do you mean? We're not going to Cheyenne anymore. We're not going anywhere that someone else has already decided our fate. Grace stood up, her movements decisive. We're going to find our own place and make our own way. Grace, I don't have enough money to buy land. After Tommy's news, I don't even have prospects for work. We can't just wander around Wyoming territory hoping something will turn up. Grace smiled, and there was something in her expression that reminded Cole of the moment she had drawn her gun on the outlaws. Cole Bennett, it's time I told you something about that $500 I've been carrying. She moved to her pack and pulled out the leather pouch, weighing it in her hand. This isn't just Robert's savings from his cavalry pay. When he died in that mine, he was working for a man named Harrison Fletcher, who owned 3 claims in the Deadwood area, my mom. Fletcher felt so bad about what happened that he offered to buy Robert's personal effects at well above their actual value. Grace opened the pouch, revealing not just coin, but also official-looking papers. These are claim certificates, Cole. Robert owned a quarter share in one of Fletcher's most profitable mines. When he died, that share passed to me, and Fletcher bought it back for cash. Cole stared at the documents, not quite believing what he was seeing. How much cash? Enough to buy good land and stock it properly. Enough to start a ranch of our own instead of working for someone else. Grace's eyes shone with excitement. Enough to build something that belongs to us, something that no one can take away because of market prices or death or corporate decisions. The possibility was so overwhelming that Cole felt dizzy. But where? How do we find land that's worth buying, especially in winter when we can't evaluate grass or water rights? I know a place, Grace said quietly. Robert and I scouted it 2 years ago when we were thinking about leaving the mining camps. It's a valley about 60 miles north of here, near the hot springs at Thermopolis. Natural shelter, year-round water, good grass, and isolated enough that we wouldn't have neighbors trying to tell us how to run our business. She pulled out a hand-drawn map from her pack, its edges worn from folding and unfolding. Robert surveyed it himself, checked with the Territorial Land Office. As of 6 months ago, it was still unclaimed. If we can get there and file a proper homestead claim, it could be ours for the cost of improvements in 5 years' residence. Cole studied the map, seeing not just topographical features, but possibility itself. Grace, are you sure about this? Starting a ranch from nothing, especially in country that isolated, it's backbreaking work with no guarantee of success. What's the alternative? Grace challenged. Go to Cheyenne and hope your sister-in-law has room for all of us? Look for work in established ranches that are all cutting back because of the economic depression? Spend our lives working for other people's dreams instead of building our own? She knelt beside him, taking his hands in hers. Cole, we have money, skills, and determination. More importantly, we have each other. How many people get a chance to start completely fresh, to build exactly the life they want without having to compromise with what already exists? Emma looked up from the game she was playing with her siblings. Papa, what's a homestead? Cole smiled at his daughter's question, realizing that she and her siblings would grow up on land that belonged to their family, not as hired help's children, but as proprietors in their own right. A homestead is land that becomes yours if you work it and live on it. Sweetheart, Miss Grace is suggesting we find our own piece of land and build our own ranch. Would we build our own house too? Luke asked, his young imagination already engaged with the possibilities. Everything, Grace confirmed. House, barn, corrals, everything we need to raise cattle and horses. It would be hard work, especially the first few years, but it would be ours. Rose, the youngest, had a more practical concern. Would there be other children to play with? Grace and Cole exchanged glances, recognizing the isolation that their proposed life would entail. Not close by, Grace admitted, but we'd be close enough to town to visit regularly, and eventually other families might settle nearby. I want to do it, Emma declared with 9-year-old certainty. I want to live somewhere that's really ours. Luke and Rose added their voices in agreement, and Cole felt the last of his reservations crumble. These children had already shown remarkable courage and adaptability. If they were willing to embrace the uncertainty of homesteading, who was he to hold back out of fear? All right, he said finally. We'll try it. But Grace, if this doesn't work out, if the valley isn't suitable or we can't make it pay, I want your word that we'll cut our losses and find something more conventional. Agreed, but Cole, I want your word that you'll give it a real chance. Not just a few months of trying, but long enough to know whether we're building something lasting or just playing at being ranchers. And they shook hands formally, sealing a partnership that would define the rest of their lives. Then Grace pulled out her map and began to explain the route to their new home. The valley that Grace had chosen was everything she had promised and more. Hidden between protective ridges and accessible only through a narrow canyon, it offered natural shelter from Wyoming's brutal winters while providing access to the year-round warmth of geological hot springs. The springs themselves were the valley's greatest treasure, pools of naturally heated water that created a microclimate warm enough to keep grass growing even in the depths of winter. Steam rose from the largest pool, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that made the valley feel like a secret garden hidden in the midst of harsh prairie. It's perfect, Emma breathed as they stood overlooking their new home. It's like something from a fairy tale. Cole had to agree. The valley was roughly a mile long and half a mile wide, with rich soil and natural hay meadows. A stream fed by the hot springs ran through the center, providing fresh water that never froze completely. The surrounding ridges would provide protection from wind and weather, while the southern exposure ensured maximum sunlight during the short winter days. But the real test would come in spring, when they could evaluate the grass and plan for cattle. For now, they needed shelter, and they needed it quickly. The temporary warmth of the springs wouldn't be enough to keep them alive through a Wyoming winter without proper housing. Grace had anticipated this challenge. Her pack contained detailed drawings of cabin designs that could be built quickly with minimal resources, plans that Robert had sketched during his surveying expeditions. The design was simple but efficient, a single large room with a stone fireplace, thick log walls, and a roof that could shed snow without collapsing. First thing, Grace announced as they made their initial camp near the largest hot spring, we build a smithy. Even if it's just a lean-to with a forge, we need a place where I can work metal. Every other aspect of construction will require tools that I'll need to make or modify. Cole understood the logic immediately. Grace's metalworking skills would be crucial not just for their own construction needs, but as a source of income from neighboring ranchers and travelers. A skilled blacksmith was always in demand on the frontier, and their isolated location wouldn't matter if people needed horseshoeing, tool repair, or custom metalwork. They worked with desperate efficiency, knowing that winter would not wait for their preparations to be complete. Cole and the boys cut logs while Grace and Emma built the forge and began manufacturing the hardware they would need: hinges, nails, brackets, and tools. The work was backbreaking, but it was also exhilarating. Every log raised, every nail driven, every stone set in the fireplace was an investment in their own future rather than someone else's property. When Emma successfully forged her first horseshoe nail under Grace's patient instruction, the pride on both their faces was worth more than any wage Cole had ever earned. As the cabin took shape, so did their sense of family. Working together toward a common goal, facing shared challenges, and celebrating small victories, they developed the kind of bond that only comes from mutual dependence and trust. Luke proved to have an eye for carpentry, able to judge angles and fits with surprising accuracy for a 7-year-old. Rose appointed herself official bringer of tools and water, taking her responsibilities seriously. Emma divided her time between construction work and learning advanced blacksmithing techniques from Grace. Cole found himself watching Grace work with increasing admiration. She attacked every problem with the same methodical competence she had shown in repairing their wagon wheel, but now he could see the broader scope of her abilities. She understood construction, engineering, business planning, and resource management with a sophistication that came from years of practical experience. More than that, she was teaching. Every task became a lesson for the children, every solution an opportunity to explain the principles behind the practice. Under her guidance, Emma was becoming genuinely skilled at metalwork, while the boys learned basic engineering concepts that would serve them for life. Grace, Cole said one evening as they sat by their fire planning the next day's work, "Where did you learn all this? The construction knowledge, the business planning, the teaching skills? This isn't just what you picked up from watching your father's smithy." Grace smiled, her face thoughtful in the firelight. "Robert wasn't just a cavalry scout, Cole. Before the war, he was a surveyor and engineer. During our marriage, he taught me everything he knew about land evaluation, construction, and resource management. He said that knowledge was the only thing no one could take away from you, so you might as well have as much of it as possible." She poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the dark sky. "After he died, I realized that his knowledge was my inheritance, more valuable than money because it could be used to create new wealth instead of just preserving what already existed. Is that why you agreed to partner with us? Because you saw an opportunity to put that knowledge to use?" "Partly, but mostly because I saw a chance to build something lasting with people I was learning to love." Grace's voice grew soft. "Robert and I talked about having children, about creating something that would outlast both of us. When he died, I thought that dream had died with him. But with you and Emma and Luke and Rose, I get to build that legacy after all, just in a different way than I originally planned." Cole felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Grace, I want you to know something. What we're building here, it's not just mine or just yours. It belongs to all of us equally. When we file the homestead claim, your name goes on it along with mine." Grace looked up sharply. "Cole, that's not necessary. The law doesn't require a lot of things that are still right," Cole interrupted. "Your money bought this opportunity. Your skills are making it possible, and your knowledge is what will make it successful. This is your ranch as much as it is mine, and I want that recognized legally." It was a radical notion for 1879. Married women rarely held property in their own names, and business partnerships between husbands and wives were almost unknown. But Cole had watched Grace work, had seen her competence and intelligence, and he understood that their venture would succeed or fail based on her contributions as much as his own. "Are you sure?" Grace asked quietly. "Joint property ownership would give me legal rights that most wives don't have. Some people would say it's not proper, that it undermines traditional marriage roles." "Let them say it," Cole replied firmly. "Traditional marriage roles didn't save my first marriage when Sarah got sick. Traditional approaches didn't save the Circle K when market forces changed. I'm more interested in what works than what's traditional." Grace smiled, and Cole saw tears glistening in her eyes. "Then yes, I accept. Partners in everything, legal and personal." They were married 2 weeks later in a ceremony that perfectly reflected their unconventional partnership. With no minister available, they spoke their vows before witnesses that included Tommy Peterson, who had decided to try his luck as their first hired hand, and 3 neighboring ranchers who had ridden over to meet the new settlers. The ceremony itself took place in their half-finished cabin, with Grace wearing her best traveling dress and Cole in a clean shirt and jacket. Emma had forged the wedding rings from gold that Grace had melted down from jewelry that had belonged to both Sarah and Robert, a symbolic joining of past and future that acknowledged their previous losses while celebrating their new beginning. Instead of traditional vows, they spoke words they had written together, promising partnership rather than conventional marriage roles. "I promise to be your partner in building something lasting," Cole said, his voice steady despite his nervousness. "To respect your skills and judgment, to share both burdens and decisions, and to love you as the remarkable woman you are rather than trying to change you into what others think you should be." Grace's vows were equally unconventional. "I promise to be your partner in all things, to contribute my full abilities to our shared future, to love your children as my own, and to work beside you as an equal in building the life we've chosen together." When they kissed to seal their union, the assembled witnesses cheered, and Emma threw handfuls of snow in lieu of rice. It was not the wedding either of them had imagined as young people, but it was perfect for the people they had become. Spring of 1879 brought validation of every hope they had invested in their hidden valley. The grass came up thick and green, fed by mineral-rich water from the hot springs. The natural hay meadows would provide enough winter feed for a substantial herd, and the protected location meant that cattle could graze year-round in areas close to the thermal features. More importantly, word of Grace's blacksmithing skills had spread throughout the territory. Ranchers rode from 50 miles away to have her shoe their horses, repair their equipment, and create the custom tools that couldn't be bought in any store. The steady income from her forge work provided the cash flow they needed while they built up their cattle operation. Cole proved equally valuable, not just as a cattleman, but as a manager and organizer. His years of experience running crews at the Circle K served him well as they hired additional hands and expanded their operations. But more than that, his reputation for fairness and competence drew good men who might have gone elsewhere if offered only wages without respect. By the end of their first year, the Bennett Ranch was home to 300 head of cattle, 8 horses, 2 hired hands, and the most profitable blacksmith operation between Cheyenne and Billings. More importantly, it was home to a family that had been forged in adversity and strengthened by shared purpose. Emma, now 10, had become genuinely skilled at metalwork and was beginning to talk about expanding into jewelry making and artistic metalwork. Luke showed natural talent with horses and had appointed himself head wrangler despite his tender age. Rose, still just 6, had claimed responsibility for the ranch's growing flock of chickens and geese. All 3 children were thriving in ways that would have been impossible in town or working for wages on someone else's ranch. They had responsibilities, skills, and most importantly, a sense of ownership in the enterprise they were helping to build. But perhaps the greatest success was the marriage itself. Cole and Grace had found in each other not just romantic love, but genuine partnership. They complemented each other's abilities, shared decision-making, and had created a relationship based on mutual respect rather than traditional gender roles. Grace was pregnant with their first child together, a development that filled them both with joy and a sense of continuity. The baby would grow up knowing only the ranch's home, never experiencing the insecurity and uncertainty that had marked the early lives of Emma, Luke, and Rose. As spring turned to summer and their first full year of operation neared its end, Cole and Grace often sat on the porch of their completed cabin, watching their children play and their cattle graze in the protected valley they had claimed. "Do you ever regret it?" Grace asked one evening as they watched the sunset paint the surrounding ridges in shades of gold and red. "Giving up steady wages and established communities for all this uncertainty?" Cole considered the question seriously. "I regret the worry, the fear that we might fail and lose everything. But regret the choice itself, never. Even if we had failed, even if we had lost everything and had to start over, I wouldn't regret trying to build something of our own." He gestured toward the valley spread out before them. "Look what we've accomplished in 1 year, Grace. We've built a home, established a business, created jobs for other people, and proven that partnership that can be stronger than traditional authority. Our children are learning skills and developing confidence they never could have gained as hired help's kids." Grace smiled, her hand resting on her swelling belly. "And this little one will grow up knowing that security comes from your own abilities and the people who love you, not from depending on other people's decisions about your worth." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, they began to plan for the future. Expansion of the cattle herd, improvements to the house and outbuildings, perhaps even the construction of a proper school if other families settled nearby. But mostly they planned for continuity. The ranch they were building would belong to their children and their children's children, a legacy of independence and self-reliance that could weather any economic storm or social change. The grandfather clock chimed 4 in the morning, its voice cutting through the silence of the ranch house that had been Cole and Grace's home for 50 years. Jimmy sat transfixed, understanding for the first time the full scope of what his grandparents had accomplished. "So that's how it all began," Cole said, his voice soft with memory. "A broken wagon wheel on Christmas Eve led to everything you see around you. This ranch, this family, everything that defines us started with 2 people who had lost everything and were brave enough to build something new together." Jimmy looked around the comfortable room, seeing it with new eyes. The stone fireplace was the same one Cole and Grace had built in the winter of 1878. The hand-forged hardware on the doors and windows bore Grace's distinctive craftsmanship. Every beam and board represented a choice to build rather than merely survive. "Grandpa," Jimmy said quietly, "I understand now why you told me this story. It's not just about how you met Grandma Grace. It's about what people can accomplish when they're willing to take risks and work together." Cole nodded slowly. "That's part of it. But there's more, Jimmy. You're facing the same choice now that Grace and I faced then. You can look for someone else to employ you, to give you security in exchange for wages and obedience. Or you can use this crisis as an opportunity to build something of your own. But Grandpa, the depression, the economic collapse, everything's so uncertain." "Everything's always uncertain, son. The only security that really exists is what you create through your own abilities and the partnerships you build with people you trust." Cole's voice grew firm. "Grace and I started with $500 and a willingness to work. You've got more than that if you're brave enough to use it." Jimmy thought about his grandfather's words, understanding dawning slowly. "You're suggesting I start my own business instead of looking for another job." "I'm suggesting you look around this ranch and understand what it represents. 50 years ago, this valley was empty land that nobody wanted. Tonight, it's home to a profitable cattle operation, a blacksmith shop, and 3 generations of a family that's never had to depend on anyone else's economic decisions for survival." Cole stood slowly, his aged joints creaking with arthritis, and moved to the window that looked out over the valley where it had all begun. "The principles haven't changed, Jimmy. Find something people need, develop the skills to provide it, choose partners you can trust, and build something that belongs to you instead of working to build someone else's dream." "What would I build? I don't have Grandma Grace's blacksmithing skills or your knowledge of cattle." Cole turned back to his grandson, his eyes bright with possibility. "You have something we didn't have. Education. You understand banking, finance, business organization. During this depression, there are going to be opportunities for someone who can help people manage money, find financing, organize cooperative ventures." "You mean become a banker myself? Start my own bank?" "I mean find the need and fill it. Maybe that's a bank, maybe it's something else entirely. But don't let other people's failure of imagination limit your possibilities." Cole returned to his chair, settling heavily but with satisfaction. "The broken wagon wheel taught me that disasters often create opportunities, if you are prepared to see them." Jimmy sat quietly for several minutes, processing not just the story but its implications for his own life. Outside, the snow had stopped completely, and the first faint light of dawn was beginning to show in the eastern sky. "Tell me about the rest," Jimmy said finally. "What happened after that first year? How did you build all this?" Cole smiled. "That, my boy, is a story for another night. But I will tell you this, every year brought new challenges, new opportunities, and new reasons to be grateful that we had chosen to build something together, rather than settling for working for someone else." He stood again, this time with the decisiveness of a man ready to conclude important business. "Right now, you have a choice to make. You can spend tomorrow looking for another job, another chance to make someone else wealthy while you earn wages. Or you can spend tomorrow figuring out what you want to build and how you're going to build it." Jimmy rose as well, feeling the weight of possibilities settling on his shoulders like a mantle. "If I decide to try building something of my own, will you help me? Will you share what you've learned about partnership and risk-taking and building something lasting?" "Jimmy, that's exactly what I've been doing for the last 4 hours." Cole's smile was warm with affection and pride. "The question isn't whether I'll help you. The question is whether you're brave enough to help yourself." They embraced then, grandfather and grandson, separated by more than 60 years, but united by the recognition that every generation faces the choice between security and possibility, between working for others and building for themselves. As Jimmy prepared to leave for his own home and his own decisions, Cole called after him, "Remember, son, the wagon wheel was broken, but it led to everything good that followed. Don't be afraid of your own broken wheels. Sometimes they're exactly what you need to find the grace that's been waiting for you all along." Jimmy nodded, understanding finally that the story of Cole and Grace Bennett wasn't just family history. It was instruction manual, inspiration, and challenge all rolled into one. The winter of 1878 had tested 2 people and forged them into something stronger than either could have been alone. The winter of 1929 would test Jimmy Bennett, but he would not face it alone. He carried with him the knowledge that broken wheels could lead to new destinations, that disasters could create opportunities, and that partnerships built on mutual respect and shared risk could weather any storm. Outside, the Wyoming dawn was breaking over a valley that had been transformed by vision, courage, and the willingness of two people to build something together, rather than accepting what others thought was possible. It was a lesson that never grew old, a truth that each generation had to discover and claim for itself. The wheel was broken, but the journey had led home.